She did not build it to prove anyone wrong. She built it to keep her son dry. That is the part the settlement never quite understood. Not in the summer when they laughed, not in the autumn when they worried, and not even in November when the water came and the proof became impossible to argue with. They kept looking for the wrong motive, pride maybe, grief twisted into stubbornness, a widow's desperate need to appear capable in a country that had no patience for women who couldn't manage on their own. But Josephine Voss was not trying to appear anything. She was reading the land the way she had spent 20 years reading rivers, and the land was telling her something the rest of Pine Hook settlement had decided not to hear. The flood marks on the cedar trunks were 7 feet above the ground. Driftwood was caught in branches where no sane person expected driftwood to be. The soil at the edge of the low field had that particular dark color, almost black, almost oily, that comes from years of sediment settling and drying and settling again. These were not subtle signs. They were written large in the language of water on every tree and bank and low place on the property. Josie read them the way a careful person reads a warning. The man who sold her the land, a fellow named Dunmore, with a gap between his front teeth and a tendency to wave his hand at problems, told her the big flood had been years ago. The river hadn't come that high since. She looked at the mud line on a cedar trunk and said quietly, almost to herself, that rivers remember. Dunmore laughed. He thought she was making a joke. She was not making a joke. She bought the land anyway, and not because she trusted the river. She bought it because she understood exactly what she was buying, which is more than Dunmore understood about what he was selling. May of 1896. Josephine Voss was 44 years old, and she had arrived at the lower Cowlitz River with her 12-year-old son, Edmund, a wagon of household goods, a canvas wall tent, and a knowledge of moving water that no book had ever taught her. She had learned it the hard way, the only way that truly sticks, which is by standing close enough to danger that the lessons come with consequences. For 20 years she had worked in logging camps along the mountain rivers of Washington Territory. She had followed her husband Monroe into that life, and she had stayed in it because she was good at it in ways that surprised people who had not seen her work. She coordinated log drives. She calculated current speeds and drop points and the behavior of water under load. She knew when a quiet stretch of river was about to become something murderous because she had learned to read the signs that the water left behind, the color of it, the way it moved around obstacles, the particular sound it made when it was carrying more than it appeared to be carrying. Monroe had died the previous winter. A fever took him in the span of a week, burning through the logging camp above Chehalis with a speed that left no time for proper preparation or proper grief. Half the men in the camp died alongside him. Edmund survived. Josie survived. But after she buried Monroe in ground that was still half frozen, she could no longer sleep in a bunkhouse with men coughing on both sides of the thin walls. She wanted land, a quiet place, a door that belonged to her son, a table where he could sit and do his schoolwork without the smell of a camp around him. The only land she could afford sat on the lower floodplain of the Cowlitz, and everyone knew why it was cheap. The soil was rich, black, and generous good for gardens and hay and nearly anything you cared to plant. But the river lay too close. In dry months it looked harmless enough. wide lazy bends, cottonwoods, along the banks salmon, visible in the shallows on bright afternoons. But the old high water marks told a different story, and Josie was not a person who ignored stories written in mud and scar tissue. She and Edmund spent their first month living in the tent on a small gravel rise at the edge of the property. Every evening after Edmund was asleep, Josie walked out to the low land with a small oil lamp and studied the terrain with the patience of someone who understood that the land would tell her what she needed to know if she gave it enough time. She dug test holes and measured how fast water seeped in. She watched which patches of grass bent and stayed bent after even a light rain, because bent grass marks the paths where water has passed before and will pass again. She noted where puddles lasted longest after the ground should have dried. She stood at the edge of the property in the blue hour before full dark and tried to understand the shape of the place, the way water would move across it if the river decided to reclaim what had always been in the deepest sense its own. Near the center of the lower property stood 4 giant pines. They had grown into a rough square approximately 22 feet apart, each trunk nearly 3 feet across at chest height. Their roots rose above the soil in thick cords like muscles visible beneath skin, gripping the earth with the casual authority of things that have been holding on for a very long time. On the upstream sides of each trunk there were old impact scars, places where driftwood had struck during high water and left its mark and continued on its way. Those trees had not merely survived floods, they had stood in them and continued growing afterward. One evening, Edmund followed his mother out to the low land and stood beside her looking up at the pines in the fading light. He was a quiet boy, since Monroe died careful with words in the way that children sometimes become careful when they learn that certain losses cannot be spoken around, only lived with. He looked at one of the impact scars, a pale wound in the bark perhaps 8 feet above the ground, and then he looked at his mother. "The water went that high?" he asked. "Higher, probably," she said. "That is where the log hit." The water was already moving past by then. Edmund stood with that information for a moment. "Dad would have built the normal way," he said finally. It was not an accusation. It was a 12-year-old trying to orient himself in a world that had shifted in ways he was still measuring. Josie looked at the scar on the pine. "Your father built well for the life we had then," she said. "This is the life we have now." Edmund did not answer, but he did not walk away either. He stood beside her until the light was nearly gone, looking up at the 4 trees, and something in his stillness told her that he was doing what she had been doing, reading the land and trying to understand what it was saying. By late June, the neighbors of Pine Hook Settlement had begun to expect Josie to start a normal cabin. Several offered advice with the genuine friendliness of people who did not yet have reason to question her judgment. "Build close to the road," one man said, "so the boy won't have so far to walk to school. Keep the door facing east for morning light. Lay good flat stones under the sill logs and pack the earth tight, and you'll be fine." 2 feet of foundation, another neighbor added, maybe 3 if you're worried, and a good drainage ditch along the low side. That's what everyone does. That was the accepted answer to wet ground in the Pine Hook settlement. A few feet of foundation, a drainage ditch, and the faith that what had not happened recently would not happen soon. Josie listened to all of it with the courteous attention of someone who has already made up her mind. Then she hired a wagon and began hauling timber from an abandoned logging bridge further upstream, where a side channel had shifted years before and left the structure useless to anyone who hadn't thought carefully about what it was made of. Most people looked at that old bridge and saw rotted scrap. Josie walked every beam with an axe, tapping and listening, keeping only the pieces where the hardwood had stayed sound in the center despite the weathered surface. She brought back iron straps, long bolts, brace plates, sections of old plank, dense enough to serve as finished flooring. She paid $9 for the entire salvage. That number would matter later in ways that Rufus Crane could not have anticipated when he stopped his wagon on the road and saw what she was doing with it. Rufus Crane was the mill foreman for the main logging operation on the eastern edge of the settlement. He was a large man, confident in public, quick with a joke that cut just slightly too deep to be entirely friendly. He knew timber the way men know things they have handled every day for 20 years, which is to say, he knew it from one angle, the angle of production, and he knew it well. What he did not know, and what he had never forgiven himself for almost knowing, was water. 2 years before, at the Chehalis camp, Josie had been coordinating a river crossing project when Rufus proposed a design for a crib bridge that would have required placing the main support piers in a section of streambed where the spring melt consistently cut deepest. Josie had refused to approve it. She had laid out the reasons in front of the other workers clearly and without particular drama, the way she explained most things. The bridge was built according to her design instead. The following spring, the section of streambed where Rufus's piers would have sat collapsed entirely. His bridge would have gone with it. Josie's bridge stood. Rufus knew this. He had never said a word about it to anyone, but the knowledge sat in him like a stone that had worked its way too deep to remove. So when he leaned from his wagon and saw Josephine Voss hauling salvage bridge timber between 4 pine trees, raising the first pair of heavy beams 10 feet above the ground, the reaction that came out of him was not pure humor. It was something older and sourer than humor wearing humor's clothes. "You building a birdcage or a henhouse, Mrs. Voss?" he called up. Josie was threading a chain sling around a beam and did not look down. "A dry floor," she said. "For who?" "For the squirrels." She tightened the sling. "For Edmund." Rufus looked toward the river, slow and copper-colored in the summer heat, lying well within its banks, with the complacent look of a river in no hurry at all. "Water's down there," he said. "For now." Rufus turned to the man riding alongside him on the wagon seat and spoke loudly enough to carry. "Hear that, building a flood house in fair weather." The man laughed. Rufus laughed. Josie did not answer and did not look down, and they drove on. That evening at the trading post, Rufus told the story with the embellishments that stories collect when they travel through a man who is good at an audience. But there was one detail he added that was not humor, that did not get a laugh, that was meant instead to land somewhere quiet and stay there. Monroe Voss was the builder in that family, Rufus said. Good man. Now he's gone, and she thinks she can step into that. He said it simply as though it were obvious, as though it required no further comment. By breakfast the following morning, that version of the story had reached every household in Pine Hook Settlement. Philomena Grout heard it from her husband Harlan over coffee. She was 38, a practical woman with 2 young children and a neighbor's instinct for which gossip was mere entertainment and which had the power to do actual damage. She had liked Josie from the beginning, had been the first person to bring food to the canvas tent, had helped Edmund find his footing among the local children. She had heard about the raised house and had not laughed. But Harlan came home from the trading post with Rufus's version settled in his expression, and he set his coffee cup down and said that it was probably best not to get too involved with the Voss situation. People were talking. Philomena did not argue with him. She had learned over a decade of practical marriage that certain conversations with Harlan were worth having and certain ones were not, and this one fell on the wrong side of that line. She simply stopped going to see Josie. No explanation, no falling out, no scene. She smiled warmly when they passed each other at the trading post. She moved on without stopping. Edmund noticed it before his mother did. He came home from an errand one afternoon and said without particular emotion that Mrs. Grout had looked through him at the store, like he wasn't standing there. Josie set down what she was doing. She understood immediately. This was not hostility, which would have been easier to name and easier to answer. This was withdrawal, the particular silence of someone who has decided that proximity to the wrong person carries a cost they are not willing to pay. It left no mark you could point to and no wound you could dress, and it was more isolating than open mockery because there was nothing to push against. She went back to work. Sophronia Peck ran the only general store that mattered in Pine Hook Settlement. She was 55, a widow for 10 years, with the particular self-possession of women who have survived enough to stop performing uncertainty for other people's comfort. When Josie came in and ordered iron straps, long bolts, slotted brace plates, and quantities of hardware that no one building a conventional cabin would have any use for, Sophronia tallied it up and said she would hold the next order for 2 weeks in case more was needed. Josie looked at her. "You're not going to ask," she said. Mrs. Voss Sophronia said, "I have been selling goods to builders for 30 years. The ones who know what they're doing don't explain themselves. The ones who don't explain a great deal." It was the most direct acknowledgement Josie had received since arriving in Pine Hook, and it came not with warmth exactly, but with something more useful than warmth, which was respect offered without conditions. She carried it home with her, and it helped more than she would have thought possible. In the evenings that followed, while the frame was going up, she explained the work to Edmund as she went, not because he asked, but because speaking the reasoning aloud allowed her to test it against herself, to hear where it held and where it wobbled. She told him she was not nailing the beams directly to the trees. A living tree is not a dead post. It grows. It swells when wet and contracts when dry and moves in ways that are small but continuous, and a structure fastened carelessly to a living tree will be slowly unmade by the tree's own growth, the way a fence wire eventually disappears into the bark of the post it was wrapped around. Instead, she built floating collars around each trunk from pared timbers and iron straps tight enough to bear weight, but fitted with slotted plates that allowed for small movement. The beams rested on those collars. The house rested on the beams. The trees remained free to be trees, and the house remained free to be a house, and the connection between them was honest about what it was. The floor beams she set at 10 feet, higher than any recent flood mark she had been able to find after walking 2 miles of riverbank in both directions, reading the scars and the stuck driftwood and the high water lines on every tree she could find. The worst marks ran between 7 and 8 feet above normal ground in the lowest areas. She added 2 more feet because she understood something that most of the settlement had never needed to understand, which is that a river does not have to rise everywhere to destroy one particular house. It only needs a log jam at the right bend, a blocked channel, a surge around a narrow point, and the water stacks up locally in ways the general level never predicted. The space below the floor she left entirely open. No storage walls, no skirting boards, no wood piles stacked between the trunks. Water needs a place to pass, she told Edmund one evening while he held a tin of nails for her. Under us, he asked. Under us, around us, and gone. The stairway she built with a hinge at the top and a chain anchored to the front beam. In ordinary weather, it rested on a flat stone at the base. When water came, she could pull the lower end up and lash it against the platform so that floating debris would have nothing to catch, nothing to use as a lever against the structure above. Edmund watched her test the mechanism one evening, pulling the lower end of the stair up until it hung against the platform edge. It looks like a drawbridge, he said. Close enough, she said. He smiled. It was a small smile, brief, and a little surprise, the kind that happens before the face remembers it is being careful. But it was the first genuine one she had seen from him since Chehalis. Theron Aldgate came in the afternoon of a day in late July. He was the most respected builder in the settlement, a broad man in his late 50s with a folding rule that lived in his coat pocket and the deliberate movements of someone who has done careful physical work for a very long time. He had built barns and cabins and the ferry landing and the settlement schoolhouse. He was not cruel. He was not a joker. He was a man who took construction seriously as a discipline and who had strong opinions about how things should be done, opinions that were based on 30 years of experience and were therefore not entirely wrong. He stood beneath the platform for several minutes without speaking, looking up at the collars and the beam seats and the angled bracing, reading the structure, the way she had read the land. You're trusting 4 trees to do the work of stone piers, he said finally. I'm trusting roots over wet stone, she said. Trees move, so does water. This one has to move a little with it. He looked up sharply at that. He had not expected her to say that. It was not the defensive answer of someone improvising. It was the answer of someone who had thought about the question before he arrived. He stepped around one of the trunks and examined the collar closely. You'll girdle these trees if you tighten the iron wrong, he said. I left clearance. I'll loosen and reset it every spring. He looked at her then directly for the first time. That answer was not the answer of a fool. That was maintenance, scheduled and intentional. He disagreed with the design, but he could not call the thinking careless. What happens if one tree dies, he asked. I transfer the load before it fails. That easy. Number. He made a soft sound that was not quite a laugh. He spent another few minutes looking, and then he went home and thought about it. And that evening at the trading post, he told a small group of men that Mrs. Voss knew timber, but she was building a bridge where a cabin belonged. He said it without pleasure, as a simple observation, but it carried the authority of his reputation, and it changed the temperature of the settlement's opinion in a way that Rufus's jokes had not quite managed. Mockery you can dismiss. A qualified man's honest doubt stays with you. The effect reached Edmund at school. Sylvie Aldgate Theron's 14-year-old daughter asked him in the schoolyard whether it was really true that his mother was building a treehouse. He said it was not a treehouse. She said her father said it was not a real house. Edmund did not answer her. He came home and sat on the edge of the unfinished platform with his feet hanging over the 10-foot drop and looked down at the yard in the way he looked at things when he was trying to decide how to feel about them. Josie sat beside him. She waited. They call it the squirrel house, he said. Does that bother you? He considered this honestly. Yes, she nodded. It bothers me too. He looked at her surprised. You don't act like it does. Acting bothered feeds people. Then why don't we build normal? She looked out toward the river. The evening light lay flat on the water, and the river looked peaceful enough to fool nearly anyone. Because normal gets wet here, Edmund, she said. He was quiet. She pointed to the white scar on one of the pines, the impact mark 8 feet up. You see that mark driftwood hit there years ago in a flood that people here say was unusual. That mark is higher than the top of my head. He looked at the mark for a long time. Then he said, I'm not afraid of being different. She looked at him. Neither am I. He went inside. But in the night alone on the unfinished platform, with the lamp low and the river sounds coming across the dark, Josie sat with the question he had not quite asked, but that she heard underneath everything he had said. What if you're wrong? And she sat with it honestly, the way it deserved, not pushing it away, but turning it over and looking at its underside. She was not certain. No one is ever certain about a river. She had read everything available to her and built as carefully as she knew how, and the calculation said she was right. But the calculation was made by a human mind using imperfect information, and she knew that as well as she knew anything. She had one child left. She was staking his safety on her reading of flood marks and her understanding of how water behaves around obstacles, and her belief that 4 living trees were stronger than what anyone in this settlement had built before. She sat with that weight until the sky began to lighten. Then she went back to work. Mortimer Fenn arrived in September. He was the county road and drainage inspector, a lean man in a dark hat who carried a notebook and spoke with the careful precision of someone who had learned that in certain situations the appearance of neutrality is worth more than neutrality itself. He had received complaints. Several neighbors, he said, were concerned that the structure might become a hazard in the event of flooding, might break loose and damage property downstream. Mr. Fenn, Josie said, it is Mrs. Voss. He acknowledged the correction without embarrassment. He walked under the platform and studied the open space. He noted the absence of a conventional foundation. He noted the absence of masonry piers. He noted with the careful language of a man assembling a formal record that she was fastening a residential structure to living trees. That is not in any building guidance I have encountered, he said. There is not much guidance for this ground, she said. He tugged at one of the diagonal braces and found no looseness. He inspected the collar hardware. He walked to the riverbank and stood there for a moment, looking at the water. "You expect it to come this high?" he asked. "I expect it to come higher than people here remember." "That is a strong claim." "No," she said, "it is a cautious one." He wrote that down word for word. She watched him write it. He did not approve the structure. He did not condemn it. He said he would return if seasonal flooding raised concern, and then he drove away. That phrase was in circulation before 2 days had passed. Seasonal flooding raised concern. Rufus Crane repeated it at the trading post as though he had personally obtained it through official channels. The laughter that followed had a different quality, now less loose and jovial, more pointed, because official doubt has a backbone that simple mockery never develops on its own. What Josie did not know and would not learn until long after it no longer mattered was the connection between Mortimer Fenn's visit and the land transaction that had brought her to Pine Hook. Fenn's wife was a first cousin of Dunmore, the man who had sold her the property. If Josie succeeded, if she demonstrated that the low floodplain could be made habitable with the right design, the value and the usability of the surrounding land would shift in ways that were difficult to predict but impossible to ignore. Fenn was not a dishonest man. He had no conscious intention of working against her, but he had arrived at her property already tilted in a direction he did not recognize in himself, and the phrase he left behind him had done its work. Winifred Voss came in October. She was Josie's older sister, 49, a widow herself, sharp-tongued when she was frightened and tender only when she believed no one was paying attention. She had heard the stories before. She arrived multiple versions traveling through the networks by which information moves between women in adjacent parts of Washington Territory, and she had formed opinions before she saw a single beam. Then she saw the house. She stood at the base of the stairs and looked up at it for a long time, at the 4 huge pines rising through the floor platform and continuing past the roof line, at the bracing and the collars and the open space underneath, at the whole improbable structure 10 feet above the ground, and something in her expression went past concern and arrived somewhere closer to grief. Edmund carried Winifred's trunk up carefully, while Josie held the rope rail. Winifred waited until the boy was inside before she lowered her voice. "People are saying you built a camp platform and called it a home. People say a great deal." "He needs steadiness," Winifred said. "You cannot give a child stability by building a house that is held up by trees." Josie looked at the 4 pines. "That is exactly why I chose them. You always were too clever after trouble." She paused, and then she said the thing she had come to say, the thing that had formed itself during the long journey from Olympia. "Monroe dies, and now you think you can engineer grief into safety. You think if you just build it right, nothing else can be taken from you." The words landed accurately, not in the place where Rufus's jokes landed, or where Theron's professional skepticism landed, but somewhere quieter and more central, somewhere close to the fear that had kept her awake on the platform in the dark, the fear that she was not building for sound engineering reasons at all, but for reasons she could not fully name or examine without losing her nerve. She looked toward the doorway where Edmund had disappeared. "I cannot make safe," she said. "I can make safer." Winifred had nothing ready for that. She stayed 3 days. She was kind to Edmund, patient in the way that family is when it disagrees with everything but loves the people involved. On the morning she left, she stopped at Theron Aldgate's workshop on the road out of the settlement, and she stood with him for 10 minutes, and she said, before she climbed back into her wagon, that her sister had never built anything she did not truly mean. Theron watched the wagon go and stood in his doorway for a while, turning that over. The house was finished by the end of October. It did not look elegant. It looked deliberate. The 4 pines rose through open collars at each corner of the platform and continued upward past the roofline, and the X pattern bracing between them made the whole structure look less like a cabin and more like a piece of infrastructure that someone had decided to live inside. The total cost had come to $78, most of it iron hardware and stovepipe. The timber had cost almost nothing because no one else had seen any use for bridge scrap from a dead channel. The pines had cost only thought. The first storm came November 4th. Rain for 2 days. The river rose 1 foot and dropped again. At the trading post, Rufus Crane told anyone who would listen that the Voss flood had come and gone, barely wet a duck. Josie heard about it through Edmund, who had heard it at school. She acknowledged it, went inside, and stacked another armload of provisions in the upper loft. She had been watching the sky since the morning of November 11th, when a different quality of weather had begun moving in from the coast. Warm air, wet and low, pressing up into the mountains, where it did not belong at that time of year, the kind of air that finds snowpack and disagrees with it. The second storm was not going to be like the first one. The storm that broke on November 11th did not announce itself with drama. It arrived the way the most dangerous things often arrive, quietly wearing the appearance of something familiar. Just rain, just wind off the coast, just another November system moving inland from the Pacific. The men of Pine Hook Settlement looked at the sky that morning and saw weather they recognized. They did not see what Josie saw. What Josie saw was temperature. The air coming in from the coast was warm, unusually warm for mid-November, the kind of warm that belongs to October and has no business this far into the fall. Warm Pacific air climbing into the mountains does not behave the way cold air behaves. Cold air drops its moisture and moves on. Warm air carries more of it, releases it more slowly, and when it reaches snowpack, it does something that experienced river workers learn to dread before they can fully explain why. It disagrees with the snow, not violently, not all at once, but persistently, hour after hour, melting from the surface downward in a process that looks slow and feels slow, right up until the moment the creeks begin running the color of coffee. Josie had seen this sequence before, in the mountains above Chehalis, in the high country along the upper Cowlitz drainage, where she had spent 3 seasons coordinating log drives. She had watched it happen twice, and both times the men who had not seen it before were surprised by how fast the rivers moved once the snowpack began releasing in earnest. Not surprise in the way that makes a good story. Surprise in the way that costs things. She did not explain any of this to the settlement. There was no point. The sky looked like November to them, and that was what they would see until the water told them otherwise. She began moving supplies before breakfast on November 13th. Edmund helped without being asked. He had developed over the months of construction and observation an instinct for when his mother's pace changed, when the quality of her attention shifted from steady to urgent, and this was one of those mornings. He carried sacks of flour and dried beans up the stairs and stacked them in the upper loft, where the ceiling was lowest and the storage was most protected. He moved the lamp oil. He moved the extra blankets. He did not ask whether this was the flood. He already knew she would say maybe, and he had come to understand that maybe from his mother was not uncertainty, it was accuracy. They moved firewood to the upper rack, clearing the ground stack entirely. She tied the rowboat on a long line between two trees, high enough to float free if the water rose, but secured enough that it would not simply disappear downstream. She walked the yard and picked up every loose board, every plank, every piece of salvaged timber she had set aside for later projects, and she moved them to high ground or stacked them against the platform where they would not become projectiles in current. Loose boards in floodwater are not passive objects. She knew what they became, and she did not want any of them working against her. She pulled the stairway up, once testing the hinge and the chain and the latch, making sure the mechanism moved cleanly. It did. She lowered it again. Edmund stood in the doorway watching. "Is this the one?" he asked. "Maybe. You always say maybe. Rivers don't send letters." He considered this. Then he went back inside and finished his arithmetic. By midday on the 13th, the small creek behind the settlement schoolhouse had jumped its banks for the first time. It was a narrow creek, seasonal, the kind that most of the year was more suggestion than water, and the men who noticed it treated the overflow as a curiosity rather than a signal. The ground was saturated from the first storm, that was all. Normal behavior after consecutive rainfall. Nothing to rearrange the day for. The Cowlitz itself turned the color of strong tea by late afternoon, running with bark slabs and floating branches and the occasional shrub torn loose from somewhere upstream. Its voice changed deeper and more continuous, the kind of sound that sits under every other sound rather than rising above it. Theron Aldgate came to Josie's property around noon on November 14th. The water had not yet reached her land, but it was moving across the low fields to the north, threading through the dead grass in sheets, finding the low places with the unhurried certainty of water that knows where it is going and is in no particular hurry because it has all the time it needs. He found her driving additional wedges into the brace collar fittings, tightening the connection between the diagonal timbers and the trunk anchors. He stood below and looked up. "You're expecting trouble," he said. It was not a question. "Yes." "How high?" "High enough." He looked toward the brown water spreading through the lower field. He was quiet for a moment. "You could bring Edmund to our place," he said. "We're on higher ground." She stopped what she was doing. The offer was genuine. She understood that. Whatever Theron thought about her design, whatever doubts he carried about her judgment, he was standing in the rain offering her son a safe place, and she registered that without showing it. "We'll stay," she said. "Pride is poor shelter, Mrs. Voss. So is a low floor." Theron's expression tightened, but he did not answer. He stood there another minute looking at the water, and then he walked back to his wagon and drove toward his own property, which sat on a rise a quarter-mile east and which he had built 23 years before, with a foundation he could see and touch and repair, a foundation that had never given him reason to doubt it. By the time he reached home, the river had crossed the main road. Sylvie Aldgate came to Josie's land in the early afternoon, moving quickly through the water that was already ankle-deep in the low parts of the path. She was 14 and she was frightened, not for herself, but in the particular way that children become frightened when the adults around them begin to disagree about something that matters. She found Edmund stacking the last of the ground-level tools into a canvas bag to be hauled up. "My father says your mother should have taken the offer," Sylvie said. "He's not angry, he's worried." Edmund didn't stop moving. "She built it for this," he said. "I know, but what if it isn't enough?" Sylvie's voice carried the directness of someone asking a question they know is unkind but cannot help asking because it is the real question. Edmund looked at her. The answer he gave was not bravado. It was something quieter and more considered than bravado, the statement of a 12-year-old who had made a decision about where to place his trust and was willing to stand in that decision, even though no one had guaranteed him it was the right one. "Go home, Sylvie," he said. "Stay with your father." She left. She walked back through the rising water and found her father in the workshop, moving tools to the second shelf, and she told him what Edmund had said, word for word, the way children repeat things when the words seem important. "She built it for this." Theron set down the handsaw he was holding. He stood very still for a moment. He thought about what Winifred Voss had said to him on the road in October. "My sister never builds anything she does not truly mean." He had filed it away at the time, given it less weight than it deserved, because it came from family loyalty rather than technical knowledge. But standing in his workshop with water beginning to darken the ground outside his door, he found himself returning to it. She built it for this. He picked up the handsaw and kept moving tools. The water reached Josie's land in the middle of the afternoon, not as a surge but as a slow advance, spreading across the lower grass in a broadening sheet that moved with the quiet inevitability of something that has been building for a long time and is finally arriving where it was always going to go. It filled the low swales first, then it joined them together. Then it became one continuous surface moving toward the river bend, carrying the light in flat silver patches between the moving shadows of the clouds. The 4 pines stood in it. The water reached the root crowns and kept climbing. Josie and Edmund stood on the platform and watched. The stairway was already up, latched against the front beam. Below them, the yard they had cleared so carefully was gone, replaced by moving brown water, 2 feet deep and still rising. "It's under us," Edmund said. "Yes." "Are the trees holding?" She looked at the trunks. They flexed slightly in the current, a movement so small she might have missed it if she hadn't been watching for it. But the collars moved with them. The braces redistributed the load and the platform remained level. "For now," she said. He gripped the railing. "Will they hold?" She looked at him steadily. "I built them to," she said. It was the most she could promise, and it was the truth, and he knew the difference between those two things, which was more than most adults managed at twice his age. He nodded once, and they both turned back to the water. The debris began arriving with the early evening. Fence rails first, then a wooden barrel, then a section of plank wall from something that had failed upstream. Edmund tracked each piece as it appeared, calling out what he saw in the flat voice of someone concentrating hard on observation rather than feeling. Then the first log came. It entered the visible water, slowly rotating in the current. One of the cowlitz's common passengers in high water, a trunk 3 feet across and perhaps 20 feet long, bark mostly stripped, the wood pale and heavy and moving with the weight of something that had been in the water long enough to be fully saturated. It turned and found the main current crossing Josie's property and accelerated. It struck the upstream root crown of the northwest pine with a concussive knock, the kind of impact that travels up through solid wood and arrives in your feet before it arrives in your ears. Edmund felt it through the soles of his boots. He made a sound but did not step back. The log spun against the root deflected it, and it rolled under the open platform and continued downstream without slowing. Edmund exhaled. "That is exactly what it was supposed to do," Josie said. She said it quietly, not for comfort, but because it was true and because he had earned the explanation. He looked at the space below the platform, at the open water moving freely through it, and she could see him understanding, not for the first time, but more completely than before, why she had made every choice she had made about what not to put there. By evening, the settlement was in serious difficulty. Rufus Crane's lower shed had lifted on one corner and torqued until its door could no longer close. The water surrounding the Aldgate barn had reached the sill logs. The Grout family had moved their bedding to the sleeping loft after water began seeping through the floorboards, cold and brown and smelling of silt. The schoolhouse, built on a slight rise and higher than most of the settlement's structures, had become a refuge. Several families had already moved there, carrying what they could, settling their children on the benches and pews, while the men tried to understand how much higher the water was going to go. Most of them believed the crest was near. It was a natural thing to believe. The rain had been falling for 3 days. At some point, rain stops and rivers peak and water begins to recede. That is the normal progression, and the settlement's knowledge of floods was built mostly on normal progressions. The snowpack above the Cowlitz drainage did not know about normal progressions. Warm rain had been falling on it for 36 hours, and it was releasing water into the system at a rate that the river downstream could not process quickly enough. Every creek feeding the Cowlitz was running above its banks. The main channel was receiving water from a dozen directions simultaneously, and it was not close to finish rising. At midnight, the log jam formed. No one saw it happen. What they heard was a deep grinding sound that came through the rain from the direction of the river bend below Josie's property, a sound like something very large being taken apart by something larger still. Logs, brush, uprooted saplings, fence sections, the wooden frame of Rufus Crane's shed that had finally let go entirely. All of it had converged at a stand of cottonwoods along the inside of the bend and locked together into a mass that the river could not push through. Water cannot stop. It is the one thing water absolutely cannot do. When the channel ahead blocks, the water goes somewhere else, and it goes there with the accumulated pressure of everything behind it. The floodplain east of the bend began receiving water from a new direction, moving not along the channel's established path, but sideways across the flat, finding every low point, spreading around every obstacle, arriving at structures from angles that no one had planned for. At Rufus Crane's cabin, the current that had been pushing against the front wall swung to the north and hit the corner. The corner held for perhaps 90 seconds. Then the remaining section of the shed, already loose, came downriver and struck the same corner, and the cabin wall cracked at the base and the water pushed through. At the Price place, water entered from the front, filled the main room faster than the single rear window could relieve the pressure, and blew the back door out from the inside. The sound of it carried across the water clearly enough that men at the schoolhouse heard it. At the schoolhouse itself, men were tying ropes between the porch posts so that the families moving through the knee-deep water outside could hold on to something and not be swept off their feet by the current, which had developed a lateral component that no one had anticipated. At Josie's property, the current shifted. It came diagonally now, pressing through the gap between the northwest pine and the southwest pine, rather than following the previous straight line across the yard. The water below the platform rose 4 inches in less than 10 minutes. The platform groaned a single long note from the northeast brace cluster and then went quiet. Edmund woke from a half-sleep on his cot, fully dressed because Josie had told him to sleep in his clothes. She was already at the door with the lamp. He said her name in the dark. "Stay back from the rail," she said. He came to stand beside her in the doorway. The water below them had climbed past the visible root crowns and was moving fast enough to push standing waves against the windward sides of the trunks. The foam on the surface was the color of old cream, and it moved in patterns that Josie recognized as the signature of serious current rather than simple depth. Another log came smaller than the first, and this one struck the upstream trunk directly rather than the root, hitting perhaps 3 feet above the water's surface. The impact shuddered up through the tree and into the collar and through the beam and into the floor beneath their feet. Edmund braced himself against the doorframe. The log tumbled and went under the platform and was gone. A wooden barrel followed it, struck a brace, diagonally spun off and disappeared. The structure shook, absorbed it, settled. Josie moved to the measurement board she had fixed to the inside face of the upstream trunk, a simple plank marked in inches from the underside of the floor beam downward. She held the lamp close. Earlier that evening, the water had stood 42 inches below the floor. She had checked it at dusk and noted the number. Now she held the lamp closer and read the new mark left by the water climbing the wood. 34 inches. Edmund was watching her face rather than the board. She said the number aloud without looking at him, and he moved to see it for himself. They stood together in the doorway of the only dry place in the lower Pinehook settlement and listened to the rain hammer the roof and the current work against the trunks below and the occasional heavy impact of debris finding the structure and being turned aside. Josie did not pray. She did not curse at the river or bargain with the storm. She listened to the braces the way she had listened to timber her entire working life, hearing in the sounds the structure made the difference between load being managed and load approaching its limit. Every creak had a location. Every vibration had a source. The pines moved within the collars moved within the braces distributed the force across the frame, the floor stayed level. At 2 a.m, she checked the board again, 29 inches. At 3 o'clock, she held the lamp up and read the waterline a third time and stood very still looking at it, 28 inches. She waited, 5 minutes, 10, the line did not move. Edmund was awake behind her, sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, watching her the way he had watched her all his life, when something important was happening and the outcome was not yet clear. She had always been the person in his life who knew things before other people knew them, who read situations that other people were still deciding how to feel about. He had learned to watch her face rather than the situation itself, because her face told you the true thing. She turned away from the board. "The water has stopped rising," she said. He looked at the board, at the lamp-lit line of mud that marked the river's highest reach, and then he looked at the floor beneath his feet. 28 inches, he said. 28 inches. The flood had taken the woodpile, the chicken pen, the sawhorse, 2 fence sections, a tool crate she had left too low, and the lower landing stone where the stairway normally rested. It had struck the pines with logs and changed direction and struck them again and climbed past the root crowns and sat against the trunks for 6 hours. It had never touched the floor. Edmund sat quietly for a while. Then he said, "I wasn't sure." She looked at him. "I believed you," he said, "but I wasn't sure. There's a difference." "Yes," she said, "there is." He pulled his knees up and rested his arms on them and looked out at the rain, which was finally, perceptibly beginning to ease for the first time in 3 days. The darkness outside the doorway was the deep blue that comes just before a sky starts deciding to become morning. "I am sure now," he said. She sat down beside him on the floor, and they stayed there together until the light came, listening to the river work around the 4 pines below them, doing exactly what she had built it to do. When the sky was fully light, figures appeared on the porch of the schoolhouse across the water. Someone had found a piece of white cloth, a sheet or a tablecloth, or a large handkerchief, and was waving it in slow arcs toward the 4 pines. Not a distress signal, something else, something closer to the gesture a man makes when he has been wrong about something important and does not yet have the words for it, but cannot wait any longer to communicate across the distance. Edmund raised his hand. Across the water, the cloth kept moving. The rain stopped some time before full dawn, not gradually, but all at once, the way long storms sometimes end, as though a decision had been made somewhere above the clouds. The silence it left behind was the loudest thing Josie had heard in 3 days. She stood in the doorway of the platform house and listened to it. Below her, the river was still running hard through the yard, still pressing against the 4 pine trunks, still carrying the occasional piece of someone else's former life downstream. But the sound had changed. The urgency was leaving it. Water in recession moves differently than water still rising, and she could hear the difference before she could see it. Edmund slept, finally curled on his cot, with his coat still on one hand open on the blanket beside him. She did not wake him. By mid-morning, the water had dropped enough that the upper portions of the root crowns were visible again, dark and glistening, the bark stripped in pale patches where debris had scraped across them during the night. The yard was still submerged. The road was still submerged, but the level was measurably lower than the mark on the board, and that gap was growing. Theron Aldgate came first. He arrived in a flat-bottomed skiff with Rufus Crane at the bow, both of them rowing, neither of them speaking. They had been through something together in the night that had changed the atmosphere between them, though not in any way that made them friends exactly. More, that it had made certain old performances seem beside the point. Rufus had spent the night moving his family's belongings to the schoolhouse in water that reached his chest at the lowest crossing. Theron had stayed at his property and watched his workshop floor disappear under 18 inches of river, and had stood in it until nearly dawn, holding a lamp and making decisions about what could be saved and what could not. They tied off at the high line Josie had strung between the pines before the storm. She lowered the rope ladder. The main stairway was still latched up because debris was still moving below, slower now, but present, and she was not ready to give the river anything to catch. Theron climbed first. He was a deliberate man, methodical in the way that experienced builders are methodical, and he came up the ladder one careful rung at a time. When he stepped onto the platform, he stopped moving entirely. The floor was dry, not damp, not filmed with moisture from the air, not muddy at the edges from spray. Dry the way floors are dry in August, the way floors are dry in houses that the river has never visited. Edmund was awake now, sitting at the small table near the stove with a piece of chalk and his school slate, copying numbers from his arithmetic reader because his hands needed something to do, and arithmetic was something his hands knew. His boots were dry. The hem of his coat was dry. The blanket folded at the foot of his cot had never been unfolded in alarm only for sleep. The kettle was heating on the stove, and the whole room carried the smell of wood smoke and cold morning air coming through the open door, and not one particle of river mud. Theron removed his hat slowly, the way men of that generation and that region removed their hats in the presence of something that commanded it. Rufus came up behind him and looked through the doorway and said nothing at all. Josie was standing beside the measurement board. Theron walked to her, looked at the board, and extended his thumb to touch the highest water line. The mud came away on his skin, still fresh, still soft. He looked at the gap between that line and the underside of the floor beam. He measured it with his eye, the way he measured everything, with 30 years of calibrated judgment behind the look. "What is that?" he asked. "Watermark," she said. He already knew. He was asking because he needed to hear the answer said plainly in her voice in this room. "Highest point." "Yes." He swallowed. The motion was visible in his throat. He looked at the floor, at the mark, at the open water still moving below, through the gaps in the platform boards. "At my place," he said, "water's in the tool loft." Rufus was still looking at Edmund. "Our floor went under before midnight," he said. His voice was flat, not performing anything. "Our floor went under, and I had my wife standing on the bed in the dark, holding the lamp up while I tried to get the children to the schoolhouse." No one spoke for a moment. Theron stepped back outside onto the platform and began examining the structure with the systematic attention of a man conducting an inspection he should have conducted differently the first time. He checked the collar fittings on each trunk. He tested the diagonal braces with his weight. He looked at the stair hinge, still latched up undamaged. He stood at the edge of the platform and looked down at the water passing below, at the open space that had allowed the river to move through without accumulating force against enclosed surfaces. He spoke without turning around. "If you had boarded this in," he said, "it would have caught everything the river sent." Josie said nothing. "If you had left the stair down, it would be gone. The whole thing might have gone with it." Still, she said nothing. She was not going to complete the lesson for him. He was a real builder. He could complete it himself. He turned around. "If you had used dead posts in this ground," he said, and he stopped, and he looked at the 4 living pines rising past the roof line, continuing upward into the pale morning sky, and he did not finish the sentence. He put his hat back on. When he spoke again, his voice was quiet enough that only Josie and Rufus could hear it. "We built for water that stands still," he said. "You built for water that moves." That sentence did not leave. It traveled with both men when they went back to their boats, and it traveled with every person they spoke to in the following days, and it became the true summary of what had happened in Pine Hook Settlement during the November flood of 1896, more accurate and more lasting than any newspaper account would have been if any newspaper had thought the story worth printing. Rufus Crane stood on the dry floor of the house he had called a squirrel house and a hen house and a bird cage for 6 months and rubbed both hands over his face. The gesture was not theatrical. It was the movement of a man trying to bring himself fully present to something he would rather not be fully present to. "I was wrong, Mrs. Voss," he said. Josie looked at him. "The flood was higher than most people expected," she said. "That is not what I am talking about, and you know it." He glanced at Edmund, who had set his slate down and was watching with the composed attention of a child who has learned to be still in complicated adult moments. Rufus looked back at her. "I was wrong to laugh. I was wrong about what I said at the trading post, about Monroe." She heard the name. She let it sit for a moment, then helped Theron move his tools out of the water before the rust sets in. That was all. No absolution, no lecture, no accounting of what the 6 months of mockery had cost her or Edmund. She had not built the house to prove Rufus wrong, and she was not going to use the proof to punish him. There was work to do, and he could do some of it. He went. He climbed back down to the skiff, and he and Theron rowed toward the Aldgate workshop without another word between them, and that was the end of it, and it was enough. Mortimer Fenn arrived in the early afternoon in a rowboat that he was clearly not accustomed to operating. He was wet to his elbows, and his dark hat had been bent by the weather into a shape it would never fully recover from. He had 2 men from the road crew with him, both carrying measuring equipment. He tied off at the same high line and called up, "I would like to document the structure if you have no objection." Josie stepped aside. Fenn measured everything with the thoroughness of a man who understands that a record made now will be read later by people who were not present, and that those people will need numbers rather than impressions. Floor height at the upstream face, 10 feet 2 inches, highest flood mark below the floor beam 28 inches, estimated water depth at the pines during peak approximately 7 feet at the deepest flow channel. Debris impacts bark damage and mud streaking on 2 upstream root crowns. Structural members intact. Stairway intact because it had been raised before the flood arrived. Floor dry. He wrote more slowly as the morning went on, the way people write when the information is arriving faster than their previous framework can accommodate it. He examined the ground below the platform as the water continued to drop, looking at the place where the current had scoured around one exposed root without undermining the tree, looking at the debris, scratches on the bark, looking at the clear channel. The open underside had provided for everything the river had sent. "This was not luck," he said finally. Josie was quiet. He looked up at her. "You anticipated the lateral current, the jam at the bend." "I anticipated that the river would make its own choices," she said. "I built for the choices I could not predict." Fenn considered this for a long time. He was a careful man in a profession that required careful men, and he was arriving with visible effort at a conclusion he had not brought with him when he tied off his rowboat. He thought about his wife's family. He thought about Dunmore and the land sale and the conversations he had participated in without quite participating in them. He thought about the phrase he had left behind him in September seasonal flooding, raised concern, and how that phrase had traveled and what it had been used for. He opened his notebook to a fresh page. He crossed out a section of notes he had made before leaving his house that morning, notes that had anticipated a different kind of inspection, notes that were no longer consistent with what was in front of him. Then he wrote, "Structure performed as designed under extreme flood conditions. No safety hazard present. 28 inches of clearance maintained at floor level during flood crest. Recommend documentation for regional building reference." He signed it. He tore out the page and handed it to Josie. "For your records," he said, "the full report will reference this property." She took the paper. She did not thank him effusively. She folded it once and put it in her coat pocket. "That will be useful," she said. He nodded, and for the first time in their acquaintance, he looked at her without the particular careful neutrality of a man managing competing interests. He looked at her the way people look at someone they have underestimated and are honest enough to know it. He rowed back across the water and did not look back, and she watched him go, and then she went inside to tend the stove. The damage across Pine Hook Settlement took 3 days to fully reveal itself as the water receded. The accounting was not done in one place or one conversation. It assembled itself from dozens of smaller reports, neighbors comparing what they had lost, men walking through mud film rooms, cataloging the things that would need to be replaced or repaired or simply accepted as gone. Rufus Crane's cabin had mud lines 3 feet up every interior wall. His stove had shifted on its base. 2 floorboards had buckled into ridges that would need to be pulled and relaid. A small chest of his wife's belongings had floated against the ceiling until the water dropped and left it sitting in the mud with the lock rusted shut. The Price house had lost its back door and half the pantry. The pressure that had built up inside when the front wall held longer than the rear was why water had entered, filled, and found the weakest exit. Everything stored at floor level was ruin. Theron Aldgate's workshop had lost tools, seasoned lumber, and 2 finished door frames he had been making for the schoolhouse addition. The doors had been built to precise measurements over 3 weeks of careful work. They were at the bottom of the cowlet somewhere. The Grout family's root cellar had partially collapsed when the water saturated the earthen sidewalls and gravity finished the argument. Even the schoolhouse, the settlement's highest ground building, had taken damage at the lower porch supports and the base of the entry steps. The wood there had been saturated and would need to be inspected before winter put its weight on it. Josie's losses were real, and she did not minimize them. The ground fence was gone. All the firewood she had not moved to the upper rack was gone. The chicken pen was gone. 1 tool crate she had left too low was gone. The mud around the tree bases would need to be cleared and the root crowns examined when the ground dried enough to work. But the house had remained dry and usable throughout the crest. Every other family in the lower settlement measured the flood by what had come inside. Josie measured it by what had stayed out. The image that stayed with the settlement longer than any of the damage reports, longer than Fenn's official documentation, longer than the number 28 inches, which was already beginning its journey into the regional consciousness, was something simpler than any of that. Edna Price arrived by boat on the day after the crest with her 2 young children because her house still smelled of river mud and kerosene from a lamp that had tipped in the water, and the smell was making the children sick. She came without announcement or apology, simply appearing at the base of the high line, with the children wrapped in whatever dry things she had been able to find. Josie helped them up. Edmund had cleared a space near the stove. The Price children sat at the table in dry socks borrowed from Edmund's drawer, while their mother cried into a towel she held against her face quietly, the way women cry when they have been holding something back for a long time and the body finally decides it is not going to hold it any longer. Josie put coffee on and did not say anything about the crying, which was the right thing to do. The children held their feet close to the stove and looked around the room with the frank curiosity of young children in an unfamiliar place. The room smelled like wood smoke and dried beans simmering and the particular cleanness of a space that has never been wet. One of them ran his hand along the floor planks and looked at his palm, expecting mud, and found nothing. No speech Josie could have given that summer would have made the argument better than this. The children of a flooded house warming their feet on a dry floor that half the settlement had spent 6 months mocking. She gave Edna coffee and told Rufus when he arrived with a second boat where to tie off. She did not mention the name they had used for her house. She did not ask whether anyone remembered laughing. She had not built it for that. The house served 3 families over the following week as a place to dry goods, rest children, and make decisions about what came next. It was small, always had been, but in the days after the flood, the most valuable thing a space could offer was not size. It was dryness. Flowers stayed dry there. Matches struck. Wool blankets held their warmth. And for people who had spent the crest night moving belongings over their heads in the dark, that was worth more than space. Philomena Grout came alone on the 4th day. Harlan did not come with her. She climbed the rope ladder without asking and stood at the top, looking at the dry floor before she looked at Josie. "I stopped coming," she said. "In the summer." "I know." Harlan said it was better not to get involved. "I know that too." Philomena looked at her hands. She was a practical woman who had spent her marriage finding practical ways to manage an impractical situation, and she was applying that same practicality now to something she did not have the exact right words for. "I should have kept coming," she said. "Yes," Josie said. It was not forgiveness exactly, and it was not condemnation. It was simply the truth held out plainly, the way Josie held most truths, without decoration and without cruelty. "You should have. You didn't. That is where we are. The question is what comes next." Philomena straightened slightly. "Can I bring anything for the families who have been staying here?" "Bring bread if you have any that stayed dry." Philomena went and came back the following morning with 2 loaves and did not make a speech about them. Edmund met her at the top of the ladder and took the bread and said thank you, and that was how it ended, without drama, the way most things in real life end when the people involved are paying attention to what matters rather than what sounds right. 2 days after that, Harlan Grout came. He came by himself late in the afternoon, and he brought a wooden box of carpenter's tools without explaining why he had brought them. He set the box on the platform and looked at the structure for a moment, at the collars and the bracing and the open space below. "I hear they want to repair the schoolhouse," he said. "They do," Josie said. He nodded. He picked up the toolbox. "I know timber work," he said. "If you're walking the site." She looked at him. She understood what this was. Harlan Grout was not a man who said sorry. He was a man who showed up with tools. That was the same thing in the language he had grown up speaking. "Monday morning," she said. "I'll be there by 8. He went back down the ladder and rode home, and she watched him go with something that was not quite warmth, but was adjacent to it, the feeling of a situation resolving itself into something workable. Theron Aldgate asked Josie to walk the schoolhouse site in December when the mud had dried enough to inspect the foundation properly. He came to her directly, not through intermediaries, not with the cautious hedging of a man managing his reputation. He came the way one craftsman comes to another when a problem needs solving and the other person knows more about the problem. They walked the site together in the thin winter light, Josie looking at the porch and the foundation and the way the ground sloped toward the low side, Theron beside her asking questions and writing the answers in the same notebook where he wrote his materials estimates and his measurement sequences. She told him to raise the floor 3 feet on open timber piers, not enclosed skirting boards, because skirting accumulates debris and gives pressure nowhere to go. She marked 3 places where the flood had deposited the heaviest wreckage and told him not to build storage in those locations. She recommended breakaway panels at the lower front that water could remove without tearing the frame. She specified a hinged section on the entry stair. He wrote it all down. He asked how far above the mark. "Above the highest line you can find," she said. "Then add 2 feet. Animals will get under it if we leave it open below. Better animals than river." He nodded. He had stopped performing disagreement. He was rebuilding something, and he needed the right information, and she had it. That was the whole of it. By spring, the schoolhouse had been rebuilt along lines that followed Josie's recommendations more closely than anyone publicly said. The settlement's children returned to a building that stood 3 feet higher than before, open below, with a stair that could be raised if anyone ever needed to raise it again. Theron Aldgate oversaw the work. He told the men he hired exactly what to do and exactly why, using language that was his own. The ideas behind the language came from somewhere. He had the integrity not to deny when anyone asked directly. Rufus Crane came to Josie's property in January with a problem rather than an apology, which was the form he had settled on for making things right, and which she accepted without comment. His cabin could be repaired, but the ground it sat on was not going to change. He did not have 4 giant pines. He had 2 old cedars behind the house and a gravel ridge that rose about 4 feet higher than the main structure. "Can't build what you built," he said. "Don't," she said. "Then what?" "Build for your water, not mine." She helped him plan a raised sleeping room attached to the rear of the repaired cabin, set on brace posts above the highest mark the flood had left on his property, connected to the main structure, but independent enough that if the lower cabin took water again, the family would have a dry place to be and dry food to eat and dry blankets to sleep under. It was not a perfect solution. It was a better one, and Josie had long understood the difference between those two things and which one was actually available in the real world. The following spring, the lower yard around Rufus's cabin flooded again during a smaller rise. His woodpile stayed dry on the raised rack he had built along the cedar trunks. His family's food stayed dry in the upper room. He came to the trading post that week and said, in front of whoever was there, that Mrs. Voss was not crazy. She just listened to water before it got loud. It was not poetry. Coming from Rufus Crane, it was something better than poetry. It was conversion. Mortimer Fenn's county report, filed the following year, did not place Josie's name in its title. It did not need to. Everyone in the Cowlitz drainage who read it knew where the thinking had come from, the same way everyone knows the source of a river, even when the river has traveled a long way from it. The report recommended open foundations in areas subject to moving floodwater. It recommended living floors raised above observed high water marks with added margin. It recommended removable or hinged entry stairs. It recommended clearing debris from upstream areas around structures. It cautioned against enclosing lower areas where water pressure could accumulate without release. It included as a reference point the measurement documented at the Voss residence during the November flood, 28 inches of clearance maintained at peak crest. That number traveled. It showed up in conversations along river bends that Josie had never visited, carried by men who had read the report or heard it discussed at county meetings or received it secondhand from neighbors who had made changes to their own buildings based on it. Some of them raised their storage lofts. Some of them stopped boarding in their crawl spaces. Some of them walked their property lines after rain and looked at the high water marks on trees with different eyes than they had used before. None of them built exactly what Josie had built. Not every piece of ground had 4 matched pines standing in a square, but the thinking traveled, which was what she had always said was the part worth copying. Winifred Voss returned the following summer. She came without the defensiveness she had brought in October, without the trunk of Monroe's things that had given her arrival its particular weight. She simply drove up to the base of the stairway and sat in her wagon for a moment, looking at the house before she climbed down. The stairway was down its lower end, resting on the new stone pad Josie had set to replace the one the flood had taken. The house above it looked the same as it had always looked, deliberate and strange and exactly itself, the 4 pines rising past the roof line into the sky, the bracing visible between them, the open space below the platform, still empty, still unenclosed. Winifred stood at the base and looked up. "I owe you words," she said. "You don't," Josie said from the platform above. "Yes." She came up the stairs slowly, not because she was unsteady, but because she was taking her time, which was unusual for her. She stood on the platform and looked at the mud scar on the upstream trunk, the line that marked the flood's highest reach, 28 inches below where they stood. She looked at it for a long time. "I thought grief had made you reckless," she said. Josie looked toward the yard where Edmund was splitting kindling, methodical and unhurried, the axe coming down in clean arcs. "Maybe it did," she said. Winifred shook her head. "Not in the way I was afraid of." They stood together looking at the yard and the trees and the river beyond, running quietly in its banks, in the summer light, looking like the most harmless thing in the world. They did not talk about Monroe. They were both past the age where talking about the dead does anything useful for either the living or the dead, and they knew it. The silence they kept was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of two women who had arrived at the same place by different routes and did not need to map the journey aloud. After a while, Winifred went inside and helped Edmund carry kindling to the wood box, and Josie sat on the platform railing and listened to the river reading it, the way she always read it, out of habit, out of attention, out of the understanding that the information was there for anyone willing to be still enough to receive it. The house changed in meaning after the flood, the way useful things change when they have been tested and have held. Before November, it had been a spectacle. After, it became a reference. People in the settlement measured future high water against what had happened at the Voss Pines, which was what they had taken to calling Josie's property, the name arriving through the same gradual process by which places earn the names they end up keeping. Children pointed at the mud scar on the upstream trunk and asked whether the water had really come that high. Men hauling lumber to new building sites on the floodplain asked half in jest and half in genuine want of an answer what Mrs. Voss would say about this ground. Travelers on the river road stopped to look at the 4 pines and the structure between them and did not laugh. A reporter came through in 1901, having heard about the treehouse that had beaten the flood. He climbed the stairs, looked at the frame, asked questions with the confident energy of a man already composing his sentences. He asked Josie whether she considered herself an inventor. She looked at the 4 pines rising past the roof into the October sky, older now by 5 growth rings. The collars she had built still fitted correctly around them, still maintained every spring, still doing what she had designed them to do. No, she said. Then what would you call what you built? A house that knew where it was. He tried for more. He said surely she had proved the whole settlement wrong. He said surely the flood had vindicated everything she had insisted on when everyone around her was laughing. Her face changed slightly, not with anger, but with the particular expression of someone correcting a mistake that matters. The river proved it, she said, not me. He wrote around that. The story he published was about the eccentric widow and her treehouse and the flood that had confirmed her genius. It was not wrong exactly, but it missed the point in the way that stories about practical people often miss the point by putting the emphasis on the person rather than on what the person understood. What Josie understood was not a secret and was not a mystery and was not in the end particular to her. It was available to anyone willing to stand in a place long enough to read what it was actually telling them, rather than what they wished it were telling them. Every spring for the next 2 decades, she inspected the collars and reset the hardware where the trees had grown into it. She checked the braces for the early soft spots that precede visible rot. She cleared the upstream side of debris after every high water. She watched the root crowns for signs of undercutting. The house required this attention. Living foundations are not set and forget propositions. They are relationships ongoing, demanding of regular observation, and Josie gave the work what it required without ceremony. The floods came again, as floods always come again. None of them matched November 1896. Several of them filled the lower yard and moved water under the house in a brown sheet, and each time the same things happened. The pines took the current, debris struck and was turned. The hinge stair went up. The floor stayed dry. Edmund Voss grew up in that house and grew into a man who carried certain things with him that he could not have named precisely, but that shaped how he moved through the world. He was careful with measurements. He was slow to accept that the ground beneath his feet was what it appeared to be. He knew how to listen to a structure under load and hear the difference between the normal language of wood under stress and the different language of wood approaching failure. He told his own children about the night the water reached the root crowns. He told it without embellishment, the way his mother had told him things plainly and with all the relevant numbers. He told them about the measurement board and the lamp and the countdown, and the moment the line stopped moving at 28 inches. He told them about the white cloth waving from the schoolhouse porch. He never once said in any version of the story he told that his mother had been right. It would not have occurred to him to frame it that way. The house was right. The water was the evidence. His mother had simply been the person who read the land carefully enough and built honestly enough to let the evidence speak for itself. That is the whole of it. Not a story about stubbornness, though it required stubbornness. Not a story about genius, though it required careful thinking. Not a story about a woman proving her neighbors wrong, though that happened as a consequence of the real story, which was simpler and harder than any of those framings. A woman read the ground she was standing on and built for what it truly was rather than what she wished it were. She built for the water that actually came rather than the water that had not come recently. She raised what needed to stay dry. She left open what had to get wet. She gave the river less to argue with, and the river, finding less to argue with, passed through. The 4 pines kept growing. The collars were reset each spring. The floor stayed level. The floor stayed dry. And the river, moving through the roots in every high season that followed, neither knew nor cared that it had proven anything. It was simply doing what rivers do, which is find the lowest path, carry what it finds, and go.